The core of his campaign was expansion of America's western border to the Pacific. He believed it would fulfill America's manifest destiny.
The idea is that the Americans, in a sense, are God's new chosen people. And he has intended for them to settle North America. It isn't just them going, we would like to have this land, but God intends us to have this land. And so that's a pretty powerful mandate.
Talking about God's plan gives you cover to do what you want. There's no question about that.
The problem was the land Polk coveted was controlled by Mexico. Its northern territories, known as California and New Mexico. When the U.S. Congress voted to annex Texas in February 1845, Mexico broke off diplomatic relations. Mexican authorities threatened to take Texas back by force, but the threat was fueled more by passion than reason.
They knew that we didn't have money, that we didn't have an army, that our armament was very obsolete, and besides that, we were divided.
Claiming that Texas needed protection, Polk sent 1,500 soldiers by steamboat to Corpus Christi, located at the mouth of the Nueces River. Within 4 months, the Army of Observation had grown to 4,000. The troops were commanded by 60-year-old General Zachary Taylor, nicknamed Old Rough and Ready.
One of the things about Zachary Taylor that was often noted was how informal he ran his headquarters and his camp. And it didn't mean necessarily that he didn't have discipline in his army, but folks would come into his camp and they would be looking for the general, and they'd see this old man dressed in a kind of a tattered coat and pants, and they would take that person to be a servant. And they'd ask where the general was. And he'd often have a lot of fun because he'd say, oh, he's not here right now. He tended to be kind of like his name, kind of rough, but ready.
Using the intimidating presence of U.S. troops, Polk sent Congressman John Slidell to make Mexico an offer he hoped they wouldn't refuse. $30 million in exchange for Mexico's northern territories, and the agreement that the Rio Grande, not the Nueces, was the border between the two countries. A deal that would result in Mexico giving up nearly half its land.
Polk approached this whole problem confident that if he bullied Mexico enough and gave them enough money, they would sell their land. And that, I think, is a window into the way that Polk thought about Mexicans generally. Essentially, he despised them.
While Slidell waited in Mexico City for an official meeting, Polk instructed him not to push the $30 million proposal if Mexico accepted the Rio Grande as the Texas border. But before any offer could be made, Mexican officials learned that Slidell would be trying to make half their country part of the United States.
Word leaked out that this was this man's intention, and the press starts talking about horrible betrayal. You know, we're not going to have any land left once this thing's over. So it made it impossible for the government to recognize this envoy, and it only deepened the diplomatic crisis.
Mexican officials sent the Polk envoy home. Slidell wrote to the president, "Depend on it. We can never get along with the Mexicans until we have given them a drubbing." Polk quickly ordered Taylor to move his troops south to the Rio Grande, in the disputed territory.
In Polk's rhetoric, this is entirely legitimate because he, after all, is now only in southern Texas. But he knew full well that all Mexicans believed that that was Mexican territory.
By late March 1846, Taylor's troops reached the northern bank of the Rio Grande, where they built an earthen fortress named Fort Texas.
Taylor arrives opposite Matamoros and opens a dialogue with the general. And he says, why don't we agree to an armistice and hope that we can find some political solution to this crisis? But the Mexican general realizes that if he agrees to an armistice, then what he's saying is, it's okay for you to be here. He can't do that, so he refuses. So Taylor responds by setting up his cannon and training his cannon right on the square of Matamoros.
Second Lieutenant Ulysses S. Grant, 24 years old and a recent West Point graduate, was at Fort Texas.
The work of fortifying was commenced at once. The Mexicans now became so incensed at our near approach that some of their troops crossed the river above us and made it unsafe for small bodies of men to go far beyond the camp.
As tensions grew, Polk believed Mexico would either agree to sell California and New Mexico or could be provoked into taking the first shot.
Once you are in Mexican territory, in front of the army of Mexico that is in the other side, well, something like that could happen.
The provocation worked. 1 month after American troops came to the Rio Grande, Mexican soldiers ambushed the Thornton scouting party, killing 11 and taking 52 prisoners. For Polk, the timing could not have been better. When he received word from Taylor about the Mexican ambush, Polk was in the process of drafting a request that Congress declare war against Mexico.
And Taylor concludes, I suppose that we can say that hostilities have commenced. So Polk rewrites this war message to Congress and fills it full of stirring rhetoric. Mexican soldiers had crossed into American territory and shed American blood on American soil.
There are many people in Congress that have questions, but they're able to say, the first thing to do is to get troops in the field. We need to support Taylor. And so where there are people who may, under serious consideration, say, I'm not sure that this happened the way that Polk explained it, they're so patriotic and they're so much in favor of supporting the Army that they say, my country first.
Did Polk bully Mexico into a war with the United States? I don't think there's any question that he did. He assumed that intimidation would force Mexico into taking a more accommodating posture. In fact, it had exactly the reverse effect.
A week later, Mexican cannons were bombarding Fort Texas, and Grant found himself in his first war.
As we lay in our tents upon the seashore, the artillery at the fort on the Rio Grande could be distinctly heard. I felt sorry I had enlisted.
At the time of the bombardment, General Taylor, who was 20 miles away at a supply depot, returned to Fort Texas with 2,300 troops. But with 3,200 Mexican soldiers blocking his return, the first major battle of the Mexican-American War began on the field of Palo Alto. Grant described it in his memoirs.
As I looked down that long line of armed men, advancing towards a larger force, I thought what a fearful responsibility General Taylor must feel. The Mexican